Coming up on Talking Points, Queen Elizabeth was remembered earlier today in a state funeral. We have the latest coverage.
And we have the latest details on the nation's migrant crisis. Which governor sent migrants to Martha's Vineyard over the weekend?
Plus, we have the latest details on the potential of a nationwide railroad strike. Where do negotiations stand today? Talking Points starts right now. Queen Elizabeth's funeral took place earlier today in a huge state ceremony. Welcome to this edition of Talking Points. I'm Teagan Brown.
And I'm Chilekasi. Adele. President Biden was among the world leaders in attendance today. The royal family remembered the Queen in a sentimental way. And Teagan, you know, there were a lot of big moments over the course of this in terms of what this means not only for the United Kingdom, but moving forward with them and the entire world as well. Some of the funeral moments, of course, we saw during the funeral today, the Queen's coffin draped with all of the United Kingdom, England, Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland.
And you know, we saw a lot of traditions at the funeral today, and we actually saw kind of the ending of a tradition, at least for a really long time. The national anthem, of course, during the Queen's reign was Long Live the Queen, but now with Charles III coming into power and the rest of the line of succession for at least the next few people being men, that national anthem now turns into God Save the King. So we really don't know when we're going to next hear God Save the Queen again.
Yeah, you know, it could be a couple decades down from now. It could be a lot longer than that, depending on how things play out. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But one of the other things that was important to note today, Prince Harry, you know, you see, there's pictures of him next to Prince William. He didn't wear the full military uniform today. Of course, he being a working royal, not an actual monarch right now, because him and Meghan left the royal family. Yeah.
Yes, it was really interesting to see over these, past week and a half, and since the Queen's death, the role of Harry and Meghan Markle kind of in this process of mourning and just seeing how they are interacting with the people.
And the President of the United States, of course, Joe Biden, today in attendance. He visited the coffin yesterday and he said, quote, "We've had an opportunity to meet with an awful lot of consequential people, but I can say that the ones who stand out in your mind are those whose relationship and interaction with you are consistent with their reputation." So, of course, President Biden, nothing but words of respect for Queen Elizabeth after she passed away earlier this month.
Yes, and of course, Joe Biden was about 14 rows back. He did show up to this funeral just a tad late compared to, the rest of these important leaders and world monarchs that were there. And actually, among the world monarchs, there is now only one queen left in the entire world, and she was in attendance there. She's the only one left.
And as we move from what's happened now to what's going on next, King Charles III now is going to be king. The coronation won't take place for a while. We're talking about possibly towards the spring or the summer. Then we have Prince William, followed by Prince George, who's just 9 years old, by the way. Princess Charlotte of Wales is third in line to the throne at this point, at the age of 7.
And something that we talked about last week was, the consistency of Charles III's reigns, because obviously Elizabeth had a 70-year-long reign, and that's impossible for Charles to have. So it's the question of how long he's going to be in power before, sadly, his passing, and then how old will William be at that point, and how long will his reign be?
And I think one of the things we also talked about this a little bit last week, but we're also talking about it now as well, the kind of status of the royal family. People saw it as this respectable institution, and now some of that may be changing with some of the things that have gone on before that. But moving from Britain southwest to Puerto Rico now, where President Biden has issued an emergency declaration. It's in response to Hurricane Fiona, which made landfall over the weekend. Fiona has brought mass destruction to the territory's power grid, unleashed landslides, and decimated road infrastructure. The president spoke to Puerto Rican Governor Pedro Pierluisi earlier today while coming back from the Queen's funeral, saying there are over 300 federal personnel on the ground right now.
And Ukrainian forces have been regaining control slowly of Russian-occupied areas along the eastern border. This comes after a series of missile attacks last week on some of the more densely populated villages in eastern Ukraine.
Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says that Russia must be held accountable for its intense attacks that have killed many Ukrainians. Here to explain more on the strategies at play between Russia and Ukraine is Talking Points analyst Ericka Love.
Thanks, Teagan and Chile. As Russia continues to occupy cities all along the eastern border of Ukraine, Ukrainian soldiers have strategically targeted some of Russia's biggest strongholds. Over the weekend, Ukrainian soldiers were able to strike supply lines for thousands of Russian soldiers while also attacking a courthouse serving as a temporary headquarters for the Kremlin. The Ukrainian army has been seeking to isolate the estimated 25,000 Russian occupants in the eastern region along the Dnipro River. Ukraine also hit the area with missiles to limit any source of supply to the Russian army. Currently, Ukrainian forces are prioritizing taking back the city of Kherson from multiple directions. Attacks on civilians in cities along the eastern border have also increased. The British Ministry of Defense has warned that Russia is likely to increase its attacks on civilian targets as it continues to suffer battlefield defeats.
So, Ericka, what strategy does Russia seem to be using in this eastern part of Ukraine right now?
Well, you know, Russia has lost a lot of things so far in the last couple weeks. They've been recently targeting civilians and civilian infrastructures because of these defeats. There have been firefights all throughout the streets of Ukraine. The only regional city in the area that is still under Russian occupancy is the city of Kherson. But currently, Ukrainian fighters are constantly trying to start these firefights to tire out the Russian army in the hope that they surrender or retreat. But the Russian army doesn't seem to be withdrawing from any of the area.
And of course, we've been talking about this conflict for a really long time on Talking Points now. We've talked about what the U.S. has done for Ukraine and what they're kind of continuing to do. So could you give us a little bit of an update on what the U.S. is doing to help Ukraine right now?
Yeah, so we heard last night from President Biden on CBS that he's just urging President Putin not to use nuclear weapons, not to use chemical weapons, especially not on civilians. His thing is, you know, this would change the face of the war, especially considering the changes since we've had World War II. The U.S. has invested over $15 billion in this war, and they don't want to see that go to waste. It's in military education, training, medical aid. But the biggest issue right now is they want to secure the border. They don't want any more annexation of that eastern region, especially that southern region closest to Russia. The biggest plan going forward is to hopefully resurge some American people in the embassy to help restable the government in Ukraine.
And of course, we're expanding this coverage every single episode, and we actually want to toss to Chilekasi, Adele right now to discuss even more about this war.
Teagan, thank you. Sticking with the war in Ukraine, as you referenced, Russian President Vladimir Putin met with Chinese President Xi Jinping last week. In the meeting, Putin acknowledged China's concerns over recent military defeats against Russia. This comes as Ukraine recovered nearly 1,000 miles of lost territory in September alone. Here to break down how Putin's meeting impacts Russian-Chinese relations is Talking Points analyst Dominic Chiappone. Thank you, Dominic, for joining us. Can you describe what was being discussed between President Putin and President Xi?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a whole host of issues, economics, social turmoil, but the biggest one of all is easily clarifying the stance of China on the war between Russia and Ukraine. Because the big thing is both nations, or China has been exclusively silent on their stance on both Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, but also what their thought is on the conflict itself. For a little bit of context, this was a meeting with Russia, China, and an organization called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's a list of about 8 different countries, 40% of the world's population, 30% of their total GDP. The big thing, of course, is they were discussing a whole host of topics, everything from, again, economics and social turmoil to U.S. hegemony, Western influence. And there were some similarities with kind of like their discussion. There was a lot of similarities, of course, with their agreement. But the big concern is that China is trying to maintain its image on the global standing, especially with recent events in Taiwan, among other circumstances. They are concerned with creating stability around that area and, more importantly, stability economically, given the issues that this Russian invasion of Ukraine has had on the global economy.
So, over the course of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, China's position on the war has been pretty silent. You know, where does China stand on this war between Ukraine and Russia?
The most fascinating thing is, like, the relations between China and Russia have always been at odds, whether it's during the time of the Soviet Union and the early days of the Communist Party to the early days of Vladimir Putin in charge to this new iteration with Xi Jinping as the General Secretary and Vladimir Putin as the President. We have a brief timeline right here of just some of the recent events to go off of that show there isn't much clarity. February 4th, Xi Jinping declares a friendship with no limits with Russia. Just 3 weeks later, after the Olympics are being held and that whole situation takes place, Russia invades Ukraine. We've already seen by mid-September, just a couple days ago, that the meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping took place. More importantly, the first time that China has met with Russia, that those two leaders have met together since Russia invaded Ukraine. The big thing is that China has, quote, questions and concerns about the war in Ukraine, and other than that, we have no reaction whatsoever. Xi Jinping, the only other comment we have is that Putin needs to assume the role of great powers and play a guiding role to inject stability and positive energy into a world rocked by social turmoil. You can see with President Xi Jinping's language, it is super broad. There is still a lot of unanswered questions here, and hopefully we can get more clarity moving forward with this situation.
It's always something we're watching. Dominic Chiappone, thank you. Coming up on Talking Points, we have the latest on the 50 migrants sent from Texas to Martha's Vineyard over the weekend. This and more after the break.
I see you mobbing over her. Let's go. Let's mob. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Hey, yo, we mobbing. Come on, girl. Let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl. Hey, let's crawl.
Hey, welcome back to Talking Points. South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham has introduced a bill to ban abortion after 15 weeks nationwide. This is the strongest effort to limit abortion rights since the overturning of Roe v. Wade in June. Talking Points analyst Jake Morel is in studio to tell us more on how it's affecting the abortion conversation nationwide. Jake.
Chile, good evening, and we're going to look at how this bill by Lindsey Graham affects voters and specifically voter registration going into the midterms. But for now, we're going to reference voter registration effect of the Dobbs decision right now. So we'll take a look at February 2022 here. This is a 10-state average of new registered voters. 48% of those were female and 52% were male. So pretty even numbers back in February. But as soon as we had the Dobbs decision come out, now that did overturn Roe v. Wade, we have 56% female and 44% male. So a pretty big swing over a 10-state average. Now let's take a look at those 10 states. There's some interesting things in here to consider. Florida, New Mexico, Alabama, all red states. So a lot more women registering to vote, seemingly registering to vote so that they can vote for their abortion rights. We've got a swing state in there, Pennsylvania, and we've also got Kansas, which is going to be a really interesting point to talk about here because Kansas actually had a voter referendum to vote whether to keep abortion legal. So if we look at February 2022, going back again here, we have 45% female and 55% male. So actually more males registering to vote in February 2022, but a huge swing right here after the Dobbs decision. Now this is right before Kansas's referendum. We have 72% female registering to vote and 28% male. So a big swing there. Here's another visualization right there. You can see as soon as it hits June, a lot more women in Kansas are registering to vote.
And so, Jake, you know, now that Democrats have control of both the Senate and the House, you know, what is kind of the reasoning behind Lindsey Graham proposing legislation like this, knowing that most likely it wouldn't pass?
So Chile, Lindsey Graham is proposing this right now, and I mean, it's strategic. You got to think here. We have the midterms coming up in November. Right now, it's mid-September. He also had the Dobbs decision in June, so he's trying to take the momentum from the Dobbs decision for pro-life politicians, for pro-life voters, and to put it in action here so that he can keep that momentum rolling. And he also is using it to make it an issue vote for Republicans, to encourage Republicans to get out and get to the polls, because he said to them that if the GOP controls the Senate or the House, he will put this up for vote after the midterms.
Well, you said it's about, the midterms and trying to boost polling for the midterms. Where does the nation stand on this issue of abortion rights?
So the nation actually stands, statistically, America is a pro-choice nation. And that statistical gap actually grew over the summer after the Dobbs decision. More people coming out and saying that they're pro-choice and that they support the right to an abortion. So I'm not sure that this is the best idea for Graham, considering that more people are pro-choice. So if he wants to make it into an issue vote, the Republicans might actually lose that issue vote. Just as we saw in Kansas, we saw all those women registering to vote, and we saw them vote for their abortion rights, and we saw them vote to keep abortion in a state that has been red for the entirety of the 2000s.
Well, we've seen the impact, like you showed over there, with the increase in voter registration, and I think it's going to have a big impact on what happens in the midterms as well. Talking Points analyst Jake Morel, thank you. Over to Teagan at the desk.
Chilekasi, thank you. Well, last Friday, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis followed Texas Governor Greg Abbott's plan to send migrants to northeast sanctuary cities. This time, DeSantis ordered a plane full of 50 migrants to fly to Martha's Vineyard. Here to break down the reason behind the transport and what it could mean for the families involved is Talking Points analyst Katie Fongvongsa. Now, Katie, can you tell us a little bit more about kind of what happened with these migrants, all of a sudden showing up in Martha's Vineyard?
So just about last Wednesday, asylum seekers, mostly from Venezuela, were sent to Martha's Vineyard, but also to Washington, D.C. and New York, and even in front of Vice President Kamala Harris's home. But in this case, like you spoke about, there's about 50 migrants that arrived on this Massachusetts island without any advance notice to the community. Now, this place is where the wealthy usually vacation, and this is not a typical place for migrants to relocate. The seekers first arrived in San Antonio, Texas, and a woman approached them, many of them offering a better court date and resources if they chose to fly to Martha's Vineyard, by signing the contracts presented to them, in which they might have not understood the directions very clearly. The migrants agreed of being sent out to Florida under DeSantis' direction.
And Katie, what does Florida Governor Ron DeSantis have to do with this Massachusetts relocation?
So this movement was done at his hands, as his state sponsored about $12 million for immigration transportation, and he said he plans on using as much of it as he can. And the destination was for a supposed sanctuary location, but as we can see, that Massachusetts is not really what was included. But it really falls into the line of the Republican states fighting back on a trending increase of illegal immigration coming into the United States. But again, the migrants started in Texas, which they previously had a similar plan earlier this year and sent over 6,000 migrants to D.C. And now there's questions about a possible pending investigation on Governor DeSantis and about the legality of moving the migrants.
Talking Points analyst Katie Fongvongsa, thank you so much. Coming up on Talking Points, President Biden has reached a deal with freight railroad companies to end the short railroad strike. This and more in 90 seconds.
Fancy pants peanut butter? A big screen television? You haven't even bought a sofa yet. A motorcycle? When your father finds out, he's gonna flip his shoes with 2 buckles? What do you even need 2 buckles for? Mr. Big Shot, buying whiskey shots for everybody in the bar. From the looks of it, I'd say nobody even remembers. Feed the pig.
Welcome back to Talking Points. On Thursday, freight rail workers tentatively agreed to avoid a strike after negotiated terms were sent to union members for a ratification vote.
So Anna, what caused this potential strike in the first place? Can you specify exactly what negotiations are going on?
Sure. So railroad workers are currently very upset over just working conditions and sick time leave. So they, right now they can't really take medical time or personal time off without getting penalized for it. And they also are given these very long work shifts very spontaneously.
So you mentioned some of the gripes that some of these workers had. Can you specify what exactly the negotiations that were made between the railroads and the unions?
Sure. So part of this tentative deal includes a 24% increase in their wages over this 5-year period between 2020 and 2024, as well as an averaging $11,000 payout should this tentative agreement get ratified. Now, this deal also includes an extra day of paid time off, as well as no penalty for taking medical time off. It also does guarantee that their health insurance premiums will not increase.
And now we're talking about what these negotiations, came to agree on, but there's a potential that this deal can fall apart. If it does, how is that going to affect Americans?
Yeah, so we actually, on Wednesday, we saw Amtrak preemptively, they canceled some of their long-distance trains in fear that this strike would affect their freight rails. Now, although things have normalized, we're not sure if the deal will actually go through, and if it doesn't, we will likely see a lot of trains getting canceled. It's also, the rail freight is at the center of the global supply chain, and if the, the center of the global supply chain, and a lot of businesses and consumers will struggle as well.
Anna Salewycz, thank you so much. This week, the Federal Reserve will hold a 2-day meeting to discuss the rise of interest rates across the nation. Here to break down here to break this down and discuss the implications it has for the economy is Talking Points analyst Jacob Goldberg.
Difficulties, sorry about that. Coming up on Talking Points, President Biden was interviewed last night on CBS's 60 Minutes program and dodged a question about whether he'll run for president or not in 2024. We'll break down what this could mean for Democrats. Talking Points will return in a quick minute.
Did you hear about the pony with a sore throat? He was a little horse. Can I tell you a cat joke? Just kidding. Why couldn't the Why was the basketball court all wet? Why? Because the players kept dribbling all over it. Where did cats go on vacation? New York.
Welcome back to Talking Points. This week, the Federal Reserve will hold a two-day meeting to discuss the rise of interest rates across the nation. Here to break down and discuss the implications it has for the economy is Talking Points analyst Jacob Goldberg.
Last week, the stock market foreshadowed major concerns about the U.S. economy. On Friday, the S&P 500, Dow Jones Industrial Average, and NASDAQ Composite logged their worst week since June, and shipping giant FedEx saw their stock plunge 21%. This dramatic dip in prices created a loss of $11 billion in market value, and it was the worst day on record for FedEx. The reason for these economic challenges came after the company told shareholders economic trends had, quote, significantly worsened. The FedEx message is just a sign of what could come in the future weeks as the country moves towards the next earnings season. This upcoming week, the Federal Reserve will hold a two-day meeting to discuss the future of the American and global economy. Led by Chairman of the Federal Reserve Jerome Powell and leaders from central banks of England, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland, the meeting will primarily feature discussions about raising interest rates. Currently, federal rates stand at 3.25%. However, the central bank is expected to raise interest rates anywhere from 0.75 of a point to an entire percentage point. Higher interest rates generally slow economic activity, and with it, the forces that cause inflation. And this is one of Powell's most important goals.
So one thing that hasn't changed is that it won't change is that our focus is going to continue to be on using our tools to bring demand back into better balance with supply in order to bring inflation back down. That'll continue to be our overarching focus.
With these changes, many more companies may face a similar fate just like FedEx. Costco and General Mills are just a few of the companies that will be sharing their corporate earnings in the following days. And it remains to be seen if raising the interest rates will help slow down inflation or speed up a potential recession.
Thank you, Jacob. Glad we were able to get those audio gremlins sorted out. But finally tonight, President Biden appeared on CBS's 60 Minutes and dodged a question about whether he will run for president again in 2024. Take a listen.
You say that it's much too early to make that decision. I take it the decision has not been made in your own head.
Look, my intention, as I said to begin with, is that I would run again. But it's just an intention. But is it a firm decision that I run again? That remains to be seen.
So, Chile, it's interesting that he says that. Of course, he says that his intention when he ran originally was to run again, yet, here he is saying he's not sure yet. And then there's a series of variables that could go into it. Of course, over his entire term, even when he was originally running, a lot of people's concerns had to do with his health and his age.
Yeah, and we've heard it a lot, especially from Republicans while he's been in office, but a lot of Democrats also brought that up as well when he was running in the primary. This is interesting because I think it's the first time we can recall, publicly at least, where President Biden hasn't given a resounding yes to this question. Kind of apprehensive. I think part of it may come down to the midterms, but it's interesting that he's saying it now. In the past couple of months, you've kind of seen his poll numbers, his approval numbers rise a little bit after, we're starting to see some of the gas prices fall down and having things on climate and whatnot. And the NBC poll from Sunday had him at a 45% approval rating. That's a 7-month high for him, so I think it's interesting that comes right now at this moment in time.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we really have to wait to see how the Democratic Party does during these midterms, because obviously right now we've been talking about these midterms, we've been talking about these elections, and just basically the basis of a Biden-backed candidate versus a Trump-backed candidate. So it really, honestly, probably comes down to how his party does.
And there's so many factors that go into that, right? Jake Morrell was talking about abortion and how the Dobbs decision is going to factor into that. And of course, you have inflation, still going up, even though we're seeing some things of relief, especially at the pump. But with that, we'll end the show.
That's all the time that we have for you on this episode of Talking Points. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at CitrusTV News, plus like us on Facebook. I'm Teagan Brown.
And I'm Chilekasi Adele. From all of us here, have a great night. We'll see you next week.